All right, so before we get started, I would like to thank the speakers and you, the audience, for your attendance and support and participation today. This conference couldn't have been made without your support. For those who just joined, hello and welcome. My name is Alexandra. I will be the chair for this panel centered around diversity experiences in academia. Before I let our moderator, Sophie, take it away, I'd just like to go over some housekeeping items. So let me just flip over my slide here. So feel free to turn your video on, but please keep your microphone muted while the speakers are presenting. We've enabled closed captioning. You may turn it on or off by clicking the arrow next to the live transcript button at the bottom panel of your Zoom window and selecting hide subtitle. We'll be recording and streaming the sessions and stop for the last part to be unrecorded for Q&A. For workshops, the recording will be stopped after the facilitator has finished the talk. And for panels, roundtables, and discussions, the last 10 minutes will be unrecorded. And you can see all of this displayed on the slide here. We want to also provide a trigger warning, as sensitive subjects may be discussed. If any of the topics are triggering or upsetting to you, we encourage you to step away and come back as needed, and want you to know that this is a supportive environment. That being said, we are not healthcare professionals and we do not provide counseling or therapy. You can visit our website at mindsinacademia.com/resources to refer to collected resources. Please remember to remain respectful of others. Any inappropriate behavior or comments will not be tolerated, and they may result in the removal from the conference. If you need any help during the session, please contact IT in the Zoom meeting or email minds.conference@gmail.com. And you may enter questions in the chat and the moderator will read them to the speakers. Feel free to send your questions directly to me if you wish to remain anonymous. So Dr. Sophie Priscillic recently transitioned from her role as a postdoc into her new full-time role as a science communicator in the Cambridge University School of Clinical Medicine. I will now let our moderator, Sophie, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to the conference. Yes, I am Dr. Sophie Priscillic. I did my PhD in molecular nutrition at the Quadram Institute in Norwich. That's in the UK. Unless you can tell, I'm British. I did my postdoc in the sequencing of SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, detecting viral variants here in the UK and informing the government on our pandemic response. Recently, as Alexandra mentioned, I transferred from my academic career as a postdoc into a supporting academic career as a science communicator for the School of Clinical Medicine at the University of Cambridge, again working on COVID genomics. And it's my job to sort of help develop materials where we can disseminate SARS-CoV-2 sequencing knowledge across the globe, so that other nations can deal with their own pandemic response. I have quite a lived experience of mental health in academia, as I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder a year into my PhD. And I mean, a PhD is a roller coaster journey enough. It certainly is even more so when you have bipolar disorder. So I became sort of an advocate for disability inclusion and mental health awareness in academia. But that's enough about me. I think we should hear about our speakers.
Okay, I can introduce myself, and I'm really excited to be here today. Hi, I'm Olivia Ghosh-Swaby. I'm currently a PhD student in my third year at Western University in London, Ontario, Canada, so I'm not over in the UK. I particularly am interested in the impacts of diets on, so high fat, high sugar diet specifically, on cognition and memory, as well as mood. Some of the things that I try to prioritize is ways in which we can enhance some endogenous or naturally occurring processes in the brain to support brain health. And that's through exercise, a great one, also great for mood as well. And these therapeutic drugs that are known as anti-diabetic drugs that are really great at reversing these diet-related effects, as well as enhancing the brain in different ways. My journey with mental health is something personal, specifically with a parent of mine who has struggled with mental health and has up until this day. And it's also impacted my career in academia because it's become something I appreciate and prioritize and want to support and facilitate for others in different ways. And of course, when it intersects with my various identities, I am very much aware of the impact academia has on the journey of those who identify with different backgrounds, specifically underrepresented groups, and how mental health becomes a huge component to that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sophie Kolo, and I am the creator and host of a website called Global Health Agent, which empowers people to live longer and healthier lives. By health, we look at all dimensions, so from emotional, physical, and mental health. I am also a science writer, and I contribute to Forbes on these same topics. So how isolation does also affect our mental health. I spent many years in the lab after my degrees in bioinformatics and public health. And I think the last 5 years is when I really wanted to talk about what's going on in the labs and also with researchers to the public. My own journey in mental health has been also quite personal to me. Doing my time in college and doing my master's, the whole culture of academia for me was quite toxic, and I can talk more about that during this chat. And I think that really did impact me both mentally and emotionally. And this whole topic of resilience is what I'd like to also discuss, because when we don't have supportive factors, it can really impact our health. Thank you.
Awesome. So I think I'm the last one to introduce myself. So my name is Tang. My pronouns are she, her, and I completed my Bachelor of Arts Honors in Psychology at the University of Calgary in Canada. And I'm currently a third-year PhD clinical psychology student at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, also Canada. So my research primarily examines addictive disorders, so gambling, video gaming, as well as its association with mental health, so depression, anxiety, as well as the interplay of sociocultural factors such as stigma and the role of culture. And so I also have lived experience with mental health. I'm a very passionate advocate for mental health and diversity, including those who are disabled in higher education. So I'm very, very excited to be here. So for me, my advocacy is primarily around the area of stigma reduction, particularly among clinicians, like mental health professionals. We still know stigma is such a prevalent thing. And although a lot of us are training to become psychologists or clinicians, there's still a lot of stigma from professors, higher education. So overall, just very, very excited to be here. And I'm very honored to sit on this wonderful panel. And so another thing I also love to do is to really engage in self-care and do a lot of advocacy around that. So in my spare time, I really enjoy painting, hiking, and traveling. Thank you.
Wonderful. So now we've had an introduction from our speakers, I will proceed by asking the speakers some questions to delve into a little bit more about them and their experiences of mental health and of life more generally, and how academia fits into both of those things? Because sometimes it does fit in and sometimes it doesn't, right? So I was particularly interested, Olivia, you talked about various identities. And I thought that that was a really good way of saying something that I've struggled to say eloquently for quite a while. How do you think that, what does mental health mean to you in terms of those various identities? Are there any conflicts there? And is academia one of those identities? Or does it play a small part in many of them?
That's a really great question, because I've never actually thought about academia fitting as an identity itself. I guess the things that I naturally associate with my identity are some of the physical features in which how socially or social constructs are based around those things, and that'll influence the experiences or opportunities I'm given accordingly. So of course, I identify as a woman. My pronouns are she and her. I am Black and South Asian, so I have a bit of a mixed identity, often not knowing which group I fit in with best. So that's a whole other discussion in itself. And yeah, and I guess academia does add another layer to that. One, the environment we're in and how that supports or discriminates against various identities. And the other component to that is how others perceive being in a position of academia, because a lot of that is not well understood from those who aren't in an academic space. And that obviously dictates the expectation, the level of education, kind of you being on this pedestal, which sometimes is also where you're finding your own journey, and that definitely influences your own experiences through this. And I think, touching on that, there's some natural pressures. You're expected to succeed in higher education to a capacity that is above and beyond, and high achievers tend to have actually greater struggles with mental health because there's internal pressures and external pressures as well. Another big part of that is those pressures exist, but when you have these intersecting identities, some of that is actually a lot harder to achieve. So if you do have expectations or levels you want to be at, but you're someone who, for example, me, I am perceived as more Black to the general population and within academia, there's another added layer of where I need to be and need to get to with barriers along the way within academia. And how mental health weaves into all of that is that I think for me personally, it ebbs and flows, right? There's moments where I'm very much aware of my mental health and I'm like, I am not in a good place right now and I need to reset and come back and refocus. And that definitely impacts the outputs that I'm expected to have in academia. And it's often not included in the metrics to that or the extra above and beyond we do to support others in academia. Along with that. And I can go on about this as well, but I'm really curious about what the other panelists have to say on this topic.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And seeing as we are so curious to hear what the other panelists have to say, I'm going to open that same question up to Sophie and Karen. What do you guys have to say on the matter?
I can go. Yeah, I think that I mean what she just said was brilliant. I am someone who came from Nigeria to the US for school, and just being an international student, has its own things that come along with that. And of course, my culture, and of course, every family is not the same, but there was this high what's the word now, this some high impact of achievements. And I mean, there was really no talk of like self-care or mental health. It was just, get the A's, do well in school, you're going abroad and just do well. And I think it had to take for me many harsh experiences to realize that self-care is important. But I think I think when you're dealing with your own family and of course culture expectations, and of course you're in a different country, so this can all affect your mental health.
Yeah, I can add on to that. So Sophie and Olivia beautifully said this.
Thank you.
But yeah, absolutely. So for me, my identity, my intersectional identity is I am a second generation Canadian. I am of East Asian descent. Lived experience with mental health, in addition to lived experience with physical disability. So that's a lot of different things that are intersecting, right? So touching on culture, like Sophie mentioned, typically in East Asian culture, we don't know what mental health is. We don't really talk about mental health. So it wasn't until like I took a random psychology course in high school that I was like, oh my God, mental health is so cool. You can study human beings. And that's when I decided to go from biology to psychology. And here I am trying to become a clinical psychologist. But we really don't talk about mental health. And even in my program, I've seen a shift towards more mental health and wellness and self-care and trying to prioritize you over like grades. But we are a very high achieving program, and perfectionism is tend to linked with anxiety. We know that's based on research. And so overall, the culture in academia and higher education is changing, but I don't think we're quite there yet. But I'm really hopeful to see that all of these panelists, we're all working on changing the mental health culture. And hopefully one day, none of us really have to hit that point of burnout to realize, oh, hey, mental health matters, self-care really matters.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's certainly a testament to the fact that things may be slowly changing by the fact that we have the Minds Conference, of course, which is fantastic. Olivia, you mentioned something about sometimes you're more aware of your mental health and sometimes less so. And I know, Karen, of course, as you've mentioned, you are a big advocate of self-care, which is a preventative as well as a curative measure. So I wondered what your guys' opinion about our own awarenesses of mental health as academics. Do you think that we all need to be more aware all the time of our mental health? Do you think we need to be more aware in ourselves, or do you think everyone around us also needs to be aware of our mental health?
I think it's just having the conversations, because if it's just kind of on a back burner, which I think it sometimes is with academia, it's when you start to actually think about it, it's like, oh, should I actually be prioritizing my own mental health in this situation when I have to get these particular things done? And no one else is really considering that as a factor in my kind of success and my outputs. So I think that's where things become a bit problematic. And it's important to have these conversations, because sometimes you don't even recognize it in yourself until you hear from others and you hear other experiences. And knowing that there's a community of backing with that as well. And they kind of come hand in hand. So there's a project that I'm working on with another great group of graduate students at Western University in the neuroscience program called Brain Matter Chatter. It's a podcast available everywhere. I'm plugging that in, where we actually have these conversations. We bring on experts to actually delve into why these specific barriers or stigmas around mental health exist in various aspects, of course. And another topic, and Karen highlighted this, is that all the intersections to that. So we want to talk about East Asian experiences in mental health and how that can be often taboo within older generations. Same thing within South Asian culture and within Black populations as well. So it's a matter of the self-care thing is something I'm personally working on. I'm not anywhere near where I should be with actually prioritizing my own mental health, but it is something that needs to be better discussed so that it's okay. Like that, I guess that's the main point of it. It's okay to actually start thinking about those things.
I think Olivia touched on an excellent point again. So having like open conversations and having just the ability to talk about these things is so important. So one thing I always like share with my clients is like mental health is part of your health. I know we always try to prioritize physical health, because when you get symptoms of the cold, you're like, oh, I have a runny nose, or I have like the flu. That's very obvious. But with mental health, it's always, I find, like a culmination of little stressors or major stressors. And then it hits a point where it's a tipping point. And then you hit, for example, burnout. Or for me, I had a major panic attack and I was like, oh, okay, this is not good. Maybe we shouldn't ever hit this point again, because that's really hard to get back from, especially when you're a busy grad student. So I always try to reiterate that mental health in itself is such a continuous and lifelong journey, and it should be synonymous to just health in and of itself. And so I do want to also say that mental health is very idiosyncratic to all of us, but it is something that we all have in common as human beings. So just to approach mental health and self-care at your own pace, again, because it is so different for all of us. And sometimes, like, I'm okay advocating about this on Twitter, but maybe you're not quite there yet, and that is totally okay. So perhaps sharing with a friend when you're really struggling, or even just sharing like the little nuances, like those little situations that happen throughout a day that you're like, this is really bugging me. So you can try and like nip it in the bud before it culminates into something where it's like, ooh, had a nervous breakdown. This is not good for my health. And similarly, self-care. So very buzzword that we've been using a lot with COVID. I am no expert in this either, but it's just the little things. So for me, I really, really try and prioritize me time. So that for me is taking evenings and weekends off. I know that might sound wild as a PhD student, but it's my time to just recharge and make sure I'm okay, and just do a little check-in with yourself.
And if I can quickly chime in there, I like really what Karen said, because when you think about it, if you took a step back and you started prioritizing your mental health, your outputs, if that is something that you're driven by, will actually be even better, right? So if you are in some way deteriorating mentally, just because you haven't been prioritizing yourself, think about how that'll reflect in your lab work, for example, or in your writing, or in your everyday interactions, in meetings, how you're processing information. Because of course, if you are in these forms of changes in emotion, or even dysregulated emotion, that'll have impact on your memory and on your cognitive function. This is coming from my neuroscience end. Had to include.
And Sophie, I wanted to just follow up on what Olivia said about outputs and prioritizing mental health. So I transitioned from work as a postdoc, which was stressful and heavily academic, into a communications role. Now I'm a science communicator. And I found that focusing on something I really enjoy was sort of like self-care for me, and my outputs improved. As a science writer, do you find that you get that same self-care vibe from the work that you do?
Yeah, totally. I think that even with, being a science writer, I have to kind of like just prepare myself even before I write a piece, because sometimes, you can be, because I sometimes write heavy topics about, our mental health, or, and COVID-19, of course, has caused so much isolation in our various communities. So I think like and of course I have to go out into the field and interview people who are really going through like really like heavy things, whether it's just lack of family support, or or financial breakdowns. So I think for me, I have to kind of like like recharge. So that's either by taking walks, or music, or even dancing. And and of course just trying to call friends too. So yeah, because I think as Olivia and Karen said, I think it's really critical to really ask ourselves, like how we're doing, and really just see how our mental space is, because I think, as Karen said, if we don't do that, right, we could reach a point of burnout or breakdown, which is what we should at least try and avoid, because there's just so much that's coming at us in life, with our schoolwork, or PhD programs, or even undergrads, even, or family, or triggers, right? So it's just good to really check in with ourselves, that, so that we don't reach this point of like burnout, which can happen often. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And we've talked a lot already about checking in with ourselves and self-care and the things that we can do for ourselves to support our mental health. But I'm curious, what help or support have you guys accessed, locally or from your institutions, the people around you? Clearly, one place you can go for a bit of a pep talk is Karen's Twitter. She's just mentioned that she advocates on Twitter. So I think this would be a great time for Karen to tell us where you can find her on Twitter.
That was so good.
Can you tell I work in scientific communications and marketing? I think you can. So if you want to find Karen on Twitter, that's one place you could go for a little bit of a pep talk. But Karen, if you could share your Twitter, great. The rest of you, where have you found support and advice, either in your institutes or otherwise?
It's a good question, because I don't know if it's just within Western University per se, but in terms of graduate resources after the undergrad experience, they tend to lack, especially in prioritizing mental health and mental health experiences, as they're very different compared to a undergrad experience, right? So I think just reflecting on experiences in graduate school, it's very siloed at times, right? You're within your program, or you're within your research groups or research spaces, or within your courses, tend to be smaller, tend to be of a less diversity compared to the undergrad group. So you often do feel like you're the only one. And I think that's a whole complicated issue that has a lot of structural barriers, a lot of within departmental barriers, depending on the institution, and that'll take time. So for myself personally, I found most of my kind of support systems are within the initiatives and group-led work that I do, because we all kind of struggle together, and we share those experiences. We understand that a lot of it is in advocating to help change the systems and barriers that are in place. But that's also where I find my greatest friend group, and that is where I also find an outlet. For me, another big aspect of what I advocate for is experiences of university athletes, and I am one myself. So that is also an area where I find as an outlet is sport and physical exercise. It's also something I study, so I understand why I should be prioritizing these things, and I encourage that in others as well. But there's also a whole family and community there in itself, and it's a good break from the academic space too. You can kind of find some other areas in which you can excel to help bring things back to, oh, I've succeeded, or I finished something today, to find that support system. So those are the things that I want to highlight as potential opportunities, is kind of finding your place of belonging.
I think I liked what Olivia said. In fact, I really liked it when she mentioned the whole thing with sports, and trying to find your own tribe, as we call it. I think don't be scared to even do that, because I mean, now it's kind of changing a bit in academia, as Karen said, but I think we still have a long way to go. So one thing that I did when I was in grad school was, because the program was so competitive, I lived with people who were, who had majors in psychology or art and things like that. And that's because that's where I think I could find a safe space, because in the science field it was really just this high driven, high stress time. But I'm glad that of course things are changing now, because this was some years back. So I think just trying to look for a place where you can feel safe and belong. So whether that's sports or knitting, or like me, dance, I love Zumba. So the things I'm doing grad school, that was kind of like my people. and I could just like vent about kind of like what's going on, and of course day two, without trying to be in a space where you talk and like feel judged.
To that. So as both Sophie and Olivia alluded to, one thing I would also say is to seek out like a peer support network. So be it through Zumba or through the advocacy work you do need to really try and build your tribe or your community. Especially try and find those who you can relate to, or even going through your struggles as a grad student, as a postdoc, as an undergrad student, or folks from similar backgrounds. So you really can't do your mental health journey alone. You really do need to rely on your network. And that might be including like other grad students in your program or your cohort. I find that family can be fantastic in supporting you, and they're also very, very well-meaning, but sometimes they don't really understand all the nuances when it comes to like higher education or academia, especially if you're like a first-generation student. Like, for example, my cousin the other day was like, congratulations on your publications. Like, how much did they pay you to publish? And I was like, no, I paid them to publish it for me. So these like little nuances they don't really understand. And when it comes to mental health, like it's really nice to feel understood and validated and have folks that really, really hear you. So just try to find folks who understand like the nuances of academia or the nuances of like your culture, and that can really help you feel like validated and like a sense of belonging.
Brill. So Olivia, Sophie, Karen, are we first generation academics? Give your hand a little raise if you're a first generation academic. Yeah? Yeah? Yeah. I thought so from the conversations that we're having. I thought we were all of us first generation academics. So I'm going to ask another question now. Feel free to skip on this one if this is a little too much, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because I think it could be really useful for some of the people watching. What is your strongest memory associated with mental ill health in academia? That doesn't need to be your darkest time. You don't need to share that. What's your strongest memory, something that really captures your experience for the sake of the people listening today?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Only because I think there's a lot of little moments, and I think they all actually add up, and that probably culminates in the greater memory of all these things. But there are moments in time, especially when there's always a deep in scholarship season in academia, and then deep in also like everything is starting up again, along with the pandemic, that all contributes to all these things, especially if it took away some of those joys. So sport was ended for a bit of time for me. So I was in a state where I was like randomly crying in different parts of my random days. And then I'm like, oh, I need to talk to someone. So when Karen highlighted the fact that other people will go through or who are in academia tend to understand, to have those people to talk about it. And it happens. And it's like, oh, really, this is where I'm at. This is clearly probably a burnout moment that I need to take a chance to sit down and relax and understand that mental health is a big proponent of all of this, and that and that if it's not prioritized in any capacity, that it'll reflect in just what you're able to do in a day as well. So I think that stood out to me, and obviously they do happen various times. So when they add up, and it's like, I really do need to take a second to breathe. So that's probably what stands out.
Sophie, you look deep in thought. Do you have something to add there? You were thinking very
yeah, no, I'm just
profoundly.
thinking because there's just many, kind of like what Olivia said, just many scenarios, and I'm just, thinking how much to share or not. But I think I can go back to, let's say, freshman year in college, just, taking an English course, and, just really find it hard with the professor, because I was kind of always getting like these like, like just F grades, just to be quite direct. And I think it took like the support of the Center for Foreign Students to like get involved and everything. But it's just funny because I had to withdraw that, from that class because of the professor just for some reason finding an issue with with how I write, even though all the other people in the department were like, she writes great. So I'm just thinking about that one thing, like, why did this happen? Why? But anyway, I had to withdraw from the class, took the same class the next year, had an A, and it really did impact just how I kind of like viewed myself, my own mental health, like what's wrong, you're in your country, you speak English, you write English, but just having this issue and just really feeling out of sorts. And it's funny because that kind of like if I didn't have, of course, the support from my parents, my family, from the Center for Foreign Students, like I could have just pretty much like thought this was really about how's it with me. So I think kind of like what I would maybe tell anyone in that situation would just be to, and again, this is where I was trying to discuss like the systems in academia, because you can be doing like the right thing with your self-care and your mental health, but if the systems are not, are really flawed, just put it out there, then that really can really affect how you do your self-care or your mental health if you don't have support. It's so funny, and not to like brag here, but like seeing myself like years later being a science writer, writing for Forbes, doing a fellowship with Columbia, and I'm just like, what was all that for? So anyway, so that's kind of like the one thing that I kind of like just go back to in doing my first year in a new country, in a new class. It's just like that didn't have to happen. That really did impact me personally.
I hope that professor reads every one of your Forbes articles.
Thank you.
It just shows, I think that's a really good take-home message for the people watching and listening today. If you fail a class, you might still end up writing for Forbes.
True.
I love like the full like redemption arc story.
Right.
Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and so in terms of my strongest memory associated with mental health, I alluded to this earlier about my panic attack. But in my first year, this was like right before COVID, like February or March, right before COVID hit Canada. But that first year of clinical psych, I was like fully feeling imposter syndrome. I was like, what am I doing here? I don't belong here. And really not looking at self-care, like forgot about self-care. That wasn't even a thing on my mind. And I was focused on productivity. So trying to get those assignments in on time, those conferences you need to do, award applications, as Olivia mentioned. And so I worked, honestly, I think every day, including evenings, including weekends. And it hit me in the middle of class one day. I was in my clinical interviewing skills class, and I was role playing as like the therapist, and I had a cohort mate who was acting as like the client. And for some reason, something she said like made me have what I thought was a nervous breakdown, and I just couldn't stop crying. I was gasping like a fish out of water, and it felt like my chest was so heavy, and I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm having a nervous breakdown. I don't belong here. What am I doing here? And so it honestly wasn't till later that I realized it was actually a panic attack. And I've done like a degree in psychology. I've done like almost like, then I had like several months in a PhD in clinical psych degree, but like you really don't know what it feels like until it hits you. So that to me was almost a sign that it's important to prioritize your mental health and self-care, and not just because I am a practitioner in mental health, but because mental health, again, happens to everyone. And it does ebb and flow. Like sometimes you'll be like, oh, I'm feeling great, this is fantastic. Other times you'll be like, down in the dumps, don't feel that great. So I encourage you to like never hit that point of burnout that I personally did. It is not a fun time. Highly don't recommend it. And I'm definitely still recovering from it, like slowly but surely. But that's definitely my strongest memory. And that's definitely spurred me on in terms of like my advocacy and trying to be more open to both my clients and in general in the clinical psychology community that like we all have lived experience with mental health. That's something we should always keep in mind.
Thank you everybody for sharing. I know that that's quite hard sometimes to share such personal experiences. One thing that I'm noticing coming up quite a lot in the chat actually is the interlink between mental health and disability in academia and the challenges around taking time off. I am a disabled student, or was a disabled student, not anymore, but I was disabled with bipolar disorder during my PhD. And it was very hard for me actually to take the time that I needed to recover and then continue with my program. Karen, I know that you mentioned that you advocate a lot for disability inclusion and well-being in academia. How do you see the intersection between disability and mental health, particularly in the academic environment?
That's an excellent question. So I personally deal with both like the mental health aspect of disability, which we often disregard, but mental health is part of disability, as well as I deal with physical ailments. So I have like a very similar condition to arthritis that impacts like my thumb and my wrist. So it's really hard for me to like write notes in session. That's really painful for me. Typing notes. Writing the exam, like handwritten exams are like the worst and it's so much pain. I also deal with migraines and those tend to hit like anytime. Like mine are like triggered by weather and it's just Halifax has not been great for that. But all in all, I think that it is very intersectional. And so that's something we need to include in our advocacy, like mental health is a disability, if you so wish to call it that, as is physical health. And I hope that once we have more awareness around mental health, then there can be more folks advocating for like mental health awareness, being more open and talking about mental health, and finally considering mental health as a part of disability. And again, mental health, it does ebb and flow. So sometimes you might consider yourself disabled, sometimes maybe not so much. It is very idiosyncratic. Does that answer your question?
Wonderful. I'm just going to follow that up, Karen. For those that don't identify as disabled, as you say, we all have an experience of mental health. But for those of us who are living with a mental health experience but don't identify as disabled, what do you think we can learn from the disabled academic community?
That's a very excellent question. So I also didn't identify as disabled until honestly like a year and a half ago. I always thought there was a lot of stigma associated with it, or that like I wasn't enough to identify as disabled, or like resources they should really give to someone who had like physical health or mobility issues. I'm going to tell you right now that like you are valid, you deserve to get the help and the accommodations that you need. And of course, your feelings and your thoughts are valid. If you don't quite identify as disabled, that is totally okay. I encourage you to go on like the academic side of Twitter or to read blogs or books that talk about ableism in academia or disability. Like personally, I've learned so much since joining this community and really listening in. For example, there's a lot of language around disability. For example, like differently abled person, I was using that for a while and then realized, oh no, that's not a good one to use. So just be open to learning and growing as a person. And if you don't quite identify with that community, that is totally okay. Just do what works for you, but be open to listening to others.
Yeah, can I add to that? So I am not, well, I don't identify or pair my mental health with disabilities. This is actually the first time that I'm hearing that kind of in tandem, which is actually great because I can see how, again, and I think it was highlighted in the chat, the physical illness, we always attribute that to some form of, okay, I need to actually check in on myself, see a doctor, see a physician. Same thing applies. And I think that's super important. But I do a lot of work in EDI within the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry on the side of trainees and postdocs. And we actually did a survey to collect metrics on which students are somewhat in terms of their own identities, but also things that they are trying to navigate an academic landscape. So that includes a big portion of that survey was on disability or even just chronic illness. That's a big one. And it turns out that almost like 50% of grad students are somewhat trying to navigate academia with one disability or two, some sort of chronic illness. And in that pool and how we designed our survey, we also included mental illness as part of that. And that was a big chunk of the response in terms of where students were struggling. So understanding that there is this huge community or intersect with disability in academia, or even just ableism in general, is a big factor that we need to start discussing, because yes, we prioritize a lot of areas, but the intersects really shape our experiences. So whether you are from the Black community, but you also are Black and disabled, or Black, disabled, and from the LGBTQ2S+, the number of barriers that come with that just continue and continue. And I think that tends to be forgotten, and it impacts mental health. And once we start considering mental health as part of the disability aspect as well, it's a lot. And then that's why these resources need to be better improved for grad students, especially, or those at the postdoc level as well.
Yeah, and just to add to what Karen and Olivia have both said, I mean, I just saw a comment now about stigma being huge in academia, and how people will not share like what they have. And I think again, it just speaks to the culture of just trying to be perfect. I have also never, or at least this is the first time I'm hearing about mental health, like linked to a disability. But again, it like needs to be, to be talked about more, because we have like I never knew, for example, that stammering is a speech disability, right? But I learned about that just a year and a half ago, and and I think one of my work now is just to also encourage those who do have a stutter to like know that they have a voice and can also just continue to like do their work and thrive in their careers. So I think this is like a great panel that we're having, and I just hope that that the culture of our schools can continue to change, because it's not just for people who are well, nobody's perfect, but it's not just for people who we feel like they are. It's for people, it's for everyone, right, to come to that space and thrive.
I want to thank you all. Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt for a minute. I want to thank you all for the great discussion so far. Right now, we will pause the recording to allow for a continuation of the discussion, but without the recorded portion. Okay, wonderful. If anyone has any concluding remarks, feel free to say them now.
I can like quickly jump in. So one thing I always say is, again, keep in mind that mental health and wellness is always a continuous and lifelong journey, and it's very idiosyncratic to each one of us, similar to like how our fingerprints are. This is also going to apply for self-care. So seek out self-care strategies that are tailored to you as an individual. Keep these tools in your toolkit and make sure they are personalized to you. For example, for me, journaling does not work, but it works really well for the next person. And as Sophie alluded to, if you are interested in like mental health advocacy, that could be joining a committee if you're comfortable with that. It could be also being vocal on Twitter if you're comfortable with that. So I always recommend trying to work within the realm of what you're comfortable with. You don't have to be a vocal advocate. That if that's not what you're into, totally okay. There are other ways to make a profound impact. So just wholeheartedly embrace your very unique mental health journey, because we all have a story to tell. And just good luck to all of you. Thank you for coming.
I would just like to add a final remark as well, if that's okay, Alexandra. And that is, you don't have to expect yourself to be well all the time. You don't have to expect yourself to be a picture of mental health if you're doing everything right. Sometimes you can be doing everything right and still kind of feel unwell, and that's totally okay. If we spent our entire lives wishing that everything was perfect and that things were, that we were totally well, then we would never be happy. We'd always be stuck in a happiness trap, trying to strive for the next thing. I have accepted living with bipolar disorder that there will be times when things are not so good. And that doesn't mean I'm doing something wrong. That just means I live with a chronic condition and it's going to happen sometimes. So don't feel under pressure to, you know, look at these amazing Twitter advocates like Karen, or to attend, you know, a conference like this and see all these inspiring women and expect yourself to crack the code and know what to do. It probably won't happen like that, but that doesn't mean you're doing something wrong.
Yeah, and if I can just add one last comment too, is just talking to those too who maybe have like who, like, you know, maybe have like just very little support, so like from family to just everything else, and just to say, you know, even if it's just to have that one friend, you know, that you talk to, you know, until, you know, things get better, you know, because I know we do, you know, some people like to talk about therapy a lot, but some can't even afford that. So I think just even like, you know, whether it's, you know, with your friend or taking walks or things like that, but just really trying to find a small group of people, you know, where you can belong and feel safe, because I think there might be times in one's life where everything is just like falling apart and crashing down, and you have no support from family or even school or wherever. And I think it's just good to remember that you just, even if to find one person, and that things can get better.
Yeah, and the last thing that I'll add there is that for me personally, this is a journey that I'm still learning a lot about. It's something that I'm just trying to have more open conversations about, especially in me recognizing where I need to start prioritizing or understanding my mental health better. A lot of the conversations that have come up is that a lot in academia for my close friend group are just going through therapy, even if they don't think they need it, just to understand some of the areas where they haven't recognized some issues within themselves or an outside perspective. So finding those outlets, and I think, again, barrier to that is always exists. For me, it's now just weaving it in the EDI advocacy work that I'm doing, hearing these perspectives, and of course, engaging in it as best as I can, being actually active about it. That's a huge component to it as well.
Thank you again, everyone, for the great discussion, and thank you for everyone for joining. We look forward to seeing you in our next session following a short lunch break. So we're going to begin again at 11:50 a.m. for a roundtable discussion on how we can address financial insecurities for graduate students.